Munsterbusch, Germany, east of Aachen, September 9, 1944. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole has destroyed 12 tanks, over 250 vehicles, and more enemy soldiers than any American armor crewman in the European theater in 81 days. His tank is named in the mood. His crew calls him War Daddy. He has survived every ambush the Wehrmacht has thrown at him since Normandy. He is about to lose his leg to a single Panther round he never saw coming. The best gunner in the U.S. Army, the most experienced crew in his division. A tank that has already killed more Germans than most infantry companies. Gone in the time it takes to read this sentence. Wait, if the best American tanker alive can be torn apart by one German shell, how does this story end with American tanks winning? Here's the part that doesn't add up. On paper, the Germans should win almost every one of these fights. Thicker armor, longer guns, better optics. And yet, 3 weeks after Poole is carried off that field in Aachen, a badly outnumbered American tank battalion will corner 2 entire German Panzer brigades in the fog outside a French village nobody has heard of and dismantle them. What changes in those 3 weeks isn't the tanks. It's everything around the tanks. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why a nation that built a technically inferior tank still won the armored war in Europe, and why the answer has almost nothing to do with steel. There's a version of this story where the Panther's gun crew who hit Poole that morning gets promoted, gets decorated, and dies 6 weeks later, still convinced his army has already won. Keep that in mind. It matters later. Put yourself inside a German Panzer crew in the summer of 1944. You do not think of yourselves as desperate men holding a collapsing front. You think of yourselves as the best trained, best equipped tank force that has ever existed, because for 5 years, the evidence has backed you up. Your Panther's 75 mkw K-42 gun can punch through the frontal armor of an American Sherman at over 2,000 meters. The Sherman's short 75 gun, by comparison, struggles to kill you frontally even at point-blank range. Your glacis plate is angled and thick enough that American gunners have learned, painfully, to stop shooting at your front and go for your sides. Your optics are sharper. Your crews have fought the Soviets across a front stretching 1,000 miles and lived to fight again. The world agrees with you. Allied intelligence officers write reports warning infantry commanders to avoid frontal engagements with Panthers and Tigers whenever possible. A phenomenon develops in Allied ranks that officers openly worry about. Soldiers spotting a single German tank silhouette in a hedgerow and calling in artillery, airstrikes, anything, rather than close with it. British and American tankers start calling almost any long-barreled German tank a Tiger, whether it is one or not, because the fear has outrun the facts. That's not propaganda. That's terror doing math nobody asked it to do. And here is the sentence nobody in your crew wants to hear yet. The machine you're driving is extraordinary. The system keeping it fueled, crewed, and coordinated with everything else on the battlefield is starting to come apart at the seams, and you cannot see it from inside the turret. Now come back to the American side of the hedgerow. Normandy, late June and July, 1944. A tank commander named Sherman, not the tank, the man happens to share its name, one of 1,000 small ironies nobody bothers to mention, watches his platoon roll into bocage country for the first time. The hedgerows here aren't hedges the way anyone back home understands the word. They're earthen embankments centuries old, packed with roots and stone, taller than a man, thick enough to stop a shell. When American tanks try to climb over them, the tank's unarmored belly rears up into the sky, and for 3 or 4 seconds, every gun in the crew is pointed uselessly at nothing while the underside sits exposed like a turtle flipped on its back. The Germans figured this out almost immediately. Every hedgerow becomes a kill box. The numbers are brutal and specific. In the bocage fighting, some American armored units lose the majority of their committed tanks in a matter of days. British and American crews start calling the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's slogan, "Lights first time, every time," because a solid hit from a German gun so often means the tank brews up in flames within seconds, the ammunition cooking off, the crew scrambling to get hatches open before the fire beats them to it. Men who survive one hedgerow start writing home in a different register than they used before Normandy, shorter letters, less detail, the kind of letters that are really just proof of life. There's a near miss buried in this collapse that almost nobody remembers. In early July, elements of the 2nd Armored Division punch a narrow gap through a weak point in the German line near St. Lo, and for about 6 hours it looks like the whole hedgerow stalemate might crack open early. Then a resupply column gets lost in the maze of sunken lanes. Armor runs low on fuel at exactly the wrong moment, and the gap closes. The war grinds back into hedge-by-hedge attrition for another 3 weeks. The German High Command watches all of this and draws a conclusion that will cost them the campaign. They conclude that American armor is simply inferior and poorly led, a fair reading of the evidence in front of them, and they miss the detail that matters. The Americans aren't studying how to build a better tank. They're studying how to never fight tank versus tank on German terms again. The fix that turns this around is not a new tank. That's the part every dramatized version of this story gets wrong, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's counterintuitive enough to change how you see everything that follows. The Sherman rolling into France in September looks almost identical to the one that burned in the hedgerows in June. What's different is who's allowed to make decisions and how fast information moves. On July 14, 1944, near a shattered French farmhouse, a National Guard sergeant named Curtis Cullen demonstrates something to Lieutenant General Omar Bradley that has nothing to do with guns or armor plating. It's a set of steel prongs, cut from German beach obstacles and welded to a Sherman's hull, designed to punch straight through a hedgerow instead of climbing helplessly over it. Bradley watches it tear through a hedge in seconds and orders it fitted to as many tanks as possible before the coming breakout. Small thing, it changes everything that happens 11 days later, but the deeper shift is philosophical and it happens quietly in how orders get written. American doctrine starts leaning hard into something the rigid German command culture struggles to match: mission-type orders. Tell a captain, a lieutenant, a staff sergeant what the objective is and trust him to get there, instead of dictating exactly how. It sounds almost too simple to matter. It will turn out to be the whole ballgame. If Bradley says no to that demonstration on July 14th, if the Army stays wedded to top-down control instead of trusting its sergeants, everything you're about to hear happens differently or doesn't happen at all. So what actually gets built in these weeks? Break it down, because each piece is a weapon in its own right. The first pillar is the radio net. Every single American Sherman rolls off the assembly line with its own radio, wired into a battalion-wide net that lets a platoon leader talk to his tanks. His tanks talk to the artillery liaison riding with them, and that liaison talk directly to a battery of 105 howitzers sitting miles behind the front. German Panzer units, by contrast, have historically concentrated radios in command tanks, with many crews relying on flag signals and visual contact to stay coordinated, a system that works beautifully when your formations are experienced and your officers survive the battle. By late 1944, with veteran crews dead or captured by the thousands, that assumption stops holding. A tank platoon that can talk to itself in real time reacts to a threat in seconds. A platoon that has to watch for hand signals through gunsmoke and fog reacts in minutes. In tank combat, minutes are corpses, And then there was the thing nobody saw coming. It wasn't a gun. It was a truck. The second pillar is what you could call the Steel River, the maintenance and recovery system running behind every American armored spearhead. When a Sherman takes a mobility kill, a thrown track, a shot-up engine, it doesn't sit there as a smoking monument. Ordnance recovery crews are trained to get forward under fire, hook up, and drag it back to a repair point, sometimes returning a tank to the fight within 24 hours. Germany's Panzer divisions, chronically short on fuel and spare parts by late 1944, often have no such luxury. A damaged Panther gets abandoned or scuttled because there's no gasoline to tow it and no factory output to replace it. A force that can lose a tank on Monday and have it firing again by Wednesday effectively fields more armor than its own numbers suggest. A force that can't repeats the same math backward, bleeding out one broken transmission at a time. The third pillar is fire and maneuver as an actual system, not a slogan. American armored columns roll with forward artillery observers embedded directly with the tanks, radio in hand, capable of calling a fire mission from a battery of howitzers and getting shells landing on a target within minutes. Overhead, when weather allows, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers work in direct coordination with ground units through forward air controllers, hunting anything German armor tries to move in daylight. It's not tanks fighting tanks. It's tanks, artillery, and aircraft fighting as one weapon with 3 different reaches. Facing that from inside a Panther is like fighting a man who somehow has 3 extra arms you can't see until they've already hit you. The fourth pillar is harder to put a number on, and it might be the most important one: the sergeant's war. American doctrine, at its best, pushes decision-making down to the men who can actually see the battlefield in front of them. A staff sergeant deciding, on his own initiative, to flank left instead of waiting for a radio call that might come 30 seconds too late. German command culture, for all its tactical brilliance, tends to concentrate authority upward, and by 1944 that upward chain is fraying, officers dead, replacements green, orders arriving late or not at all. A system that trusts its sergeants doesn't need every decision to travel to the top and back. It just needs good sergeants. And the U.S. Army, almost by accident, has been building an enormous supply of them. Which brings us to a man most people who have watched 100 World War II documentaries have never heard of. His name is Curtis Grubb Cullen III, 29 years old, born in Cranford, New Jersey, the only child of a locally prominent family. Before the war, he sold liquor for a distilling company, a sales job, nothing military about it, nothing that suggests the word inventor. He enlists in the New Jersey National Guard's cavalry squadron and ends up in Normandy as a sergeant, watching his tanks rear helplessly over hedgerows and expose their bellies to German guns. The idea, as it happens, isn't even originally his. During a griping session among enlisted men, a soldier from Tennessee wonders aloud why nobody just welds saw teeth to the front of a tank to cut through the hedges instead of climbing over them. Most of the men laugh it off. Cullen doesn't. He salvages steel from German beach obstacles left over from the invasion, cuts them into 4 angled prongs, and welds the assembly onto a tank's hull himself. When it's demonstrated for Bradley, it plows through a hedgerow like the hedge was never there. Within days it's on hundreds of tanks, ready for the breakout that becomes Operation Cobra. Cullen tries, by every account, to give credit to the soldier whose idea it originally was. History doesn't listen. The device gets his name, the Cullen device, the Rhino tank, and the other man is a footnote inside a footnote. 4 months later, in the Huichin forest, Cullen steps on a landmine and loses his own leg. He goes home, sells liquor again for the same company he worked for before the war, and dies in 1963, largely unremembered outside a small circle of historians. He is, in the truest sense, the invisible army made visible for one afternoon in July, and then folded back into the anonymity of everyone else who kept this machine running. Because behind every tank commander whose name ends up on a medal citation, there are dozens of men who never fire a shot, and without whom none of this works. Truck drivers hauling fuel and ammunition down roads German aircraft still occasionally strafe, running the same stretch of highway night after night, because a division that stops moving is a division that starts dying. Radio operators sitting in the back of a half-track relaying coordinates for hours at a stretch, voice going hoarse, headset never coming off. Mechanics elbow-deep in an engine bay at 2 in the morning, hands split and bleeding from cold steel, so a tank makes tomorrow's attack instead of sitting dead in a motor pool. Ordnance clerks tracking which battalion is down to its last belt of machine gun ammunition, and rerouting a convoy before anyone at the front even knows they're about to run dry. None of them get statues. All of them are load-bearing, and if you pulled any single one of these threads out of the weave, the whole system would still function, just slower, just bloodier, just less like the machine that terrified German commanders by the autumn of 1944. It's worth naming what this really is because it doesn't have a catchy label in most textbooks. It's redundancy built into a living organization. German doctrine, for all its tactical genius at the small unit level, tends to concentrate expertise in a handful of irreplaceable specialists. The veteran Panzer commander, the ace gunner, the one competent staff officer holding a fraying division together. Lose him, and the unit's effectiveness doesn't dip. It craters. American doctrine, almost by design, spreads competence thin and wide instead of piling it into a few brilliant individuals. Lose a sergeant, and there are 3 more sergeants who train the same way, sitting in 3 more tanks, ready to make the same call without missing a beat. So can one individual still matter inside a machine this large? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is yes, but not the way the old war movies suggest. Cullen didn't win Normandy single-handedly. But without his afternoon with a welding torch, the breakout through the hedgerows costs more men and more time, and everything downstream shifts. The system doesn't need heroes to function. It just runs faster and bleeds less when it happens to have one. The first proof that all of this actually works comes small, fast, and almost unnoticed by history. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, begins on July 25, 1944. The Germans holding the line expect the same army they've been grinding down for 6 weeks. The hedgerow-bound, road-bound force that measures its advances in yards. What they get instead is columns of Rhino tanks punching straight through the bocage in places nobody expected an attack, moving fast enough that German defensive positions built to face one direction get outflanked before their crews can traverse a gun. There's a tense stretch on the second day where a German counterattack briefly threatens to pinch off one of the lead columns, a near miss that could have stalled the whole breakout before it built momentum. It doesn't hold. The column pushes through, and within days the German front in Normandy doesn't just bend, it breaks. But this was only the preview. What came next had no precedent in the history of armored warfare on the Western Front. September 19, 1944. Lorraine, France, near a farming village called Arracourt. Dawn arrives the way it has for a week, low cloud, drizzle, and a fog thick enough that you can lose sight of a tank 50 meters away. Adolf Hitler has personally ordered a counterattack here, against General George Patton's Third Army, using 2 brand-new Panzer brigades equipped with Panther tanks fresh from the factory. On paper, this should be a massacre in Germany's favor. The Panther's gun can kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters. In this fog, visibility drops to 200. Shorter. One word, silence, then the guns. Because 182 German tanks and 80 assault guns, 262 armored vehicles in total, begin advancing toward a single American combat command under Colonel Bruce Clark, a force that can field barely a quarter of that number. And for one terrible morning, it looks exactly like every nightmare Allied intelligence has been warning about. A German officer scrawling notes that morning, the kind of fragmentary battlefield reporting that survives in post-war accounts, describes the fog as their own countrymen as much as their enemies, close enough that his Panthers can't use the range advantage that makes them so lethal in open country. On the American side, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion and the men around Clark's headquarters find themselves fighting practically muzzle to muzzle with tanks that should be killing them from a mile out. The German collapse doesn't happen because the Panthers are bad tanks. It happens because the crews inside them are new, barely 2 weeks of training, some literally unable to read a map, thrown into a maneuver battle against an enemy who can talk to his own artillery in real time and call fighter-bombers down through the clouds the moment the weather breaks. When the skies clear later that day, P-47 Thunderbolts arrive and start working German columns over from above, while Clark's tanks and tank destroyers close from the ground. Somewhere in a burning column, a German brigade commander has to choose between holding a position he can no longer see to defend, or pulling back through open ground his own reconnaissance never properly scouted, an impossible decision, made worse than either option by the fact that nobody warned him the fog would burn off by mid-morning. By the time it's over, the sledgehammer has landed. But the sledgehammer was the easy part to understand. What came next, 11 straight days of the same story repeating with variations, German reinforcements arriving only to be fed into the same trap, was the scalpel. And the scalpel was more terrifying because it meant this wasn't luck. It was a system working exactly as designed, over and over, against every fresh unit Germany threw at it. So strip away every excuse. What did the Americans actually have and not have at Arracourt? They did not have air support for most of the first 2 days. Fog on the ground meant fog in the sky too. They were outnumbered by German armor roughly 2-to-1 in the opening hours. Tank for tank, their Shermans were mechanically outgunned. A Panther could kill a Sherman frontally at ranges the Sherman's own gun couldn't dream of matching. On paper, laid side by side, the Germans had every reason to expect a rout, and their confidence going in wasn't arrogance. It was correct arithmetic, given the specs on the page. What the specs on the page couldn't capture was what happened when the fog closed the range to 200 meters and turned a technological mismatch into a knife fight, where crew training, radio coordination, and the nerve to close distance instead of retreat mattered more than gun barrel length. American tank commanders, coached into aggressive short-range tactics for exactly this scenario, drove straight at German columns instead of trading long-range shots they were guaranteed to lose. Captain William Dwight, serving as liaison officer between Clark's headquarters and the 37th Tank Battalion, spent that morning helping coordinate reinforcements into the fight in real time, the radio net doing exactly what it was built to do, moving men to the point of crisis in minutes instead of hours. When a column of a dozen Panthers pushed toward Clark's own headquarters with nothing but artillery standing in the way, gun crews leveled their howitzers over open sights and fired directly into the advancing tanks until American armor could arrive to relieve them. The moment the Germans understood they were fighting a different army than the one they remembered wasn't a single flash of insight. It was cumulative, Panther after Panther getting flanked or ambushed at ranges where its frontal armor advantage meant nothing. Radio calls bringing artillery down on assembly areas before an attack could even form up. Air strikes arriving the instant the weather allowed. Of the 262 German armored vehicles committed to the fighting around Arracourt that September, roughly 200 ended up destroyed or damaged. Clark's combat command, which absorbed the worst of the assault, lost a fraction of that, several dozen tanks and tank destroyers, not the 262 the Germans expected to be trading against. They won, with worse tanks. Outnumbered, in the fog, they won. Behind every kill ratio in that battle is a person, and it's worth slowing down here because the numbers alone don't earn the ending. Lafayette Poole never fires another shot in anger after Aachen. He's 25 years old, a farm kid from Odom, Texas, who grew up boxing and wanted to major in engineering before the war rerouted his life into a tank turret. The surgeons take his leg above the knee. He spends the rest of his service, and much of the rest of his life, defined by 81 days most of his own countrymen never fully register, because the men who tell war stories in the decades after tend to be the ones who came home whole enough to tell them easily. Poole doesn't fit that shape. He becomes, in his own words to family, someone who has to learn to be proud of what he did instead of resentful of what it cost him. On the German side, there's a soldier worth remembering too, not a villain in this story, just a man caught inside a doctrine that failed him. A Panther gunner in one of those fresh brigades at Arracourt, barely trained, had likely never fired his gun at a moving target under fire before that week. He believed, because every briefing told him to believe it, that his machine made him nearly unkillable at range. The fog took that math away from him before his crew had learned any other way to fight. Whatever became of him afterward, killed, captured, or one of the handful who escaped east, he represents thousands of young Germans who were sent into 1944 with a superb machine and almost no time to learn how to survive without the advantages that machine was supposed to guarantee. And there's Curtis Cullen again, because his story doesn't end with the medal ceremony. He goes home to New Jersey, remarries, sells liquor for the same company as before, quietly living with one leg and a device with his name on it that most Americans who benefited from it will never learn to spell. He dies at 48 in 1963, largely out of the public eye, a man who changed the shape of a campaign and then simply went back to work. And somewhere behind him, unnamed in most accounts, is the soldier from Tennessee who actually said the words first, "Why don't we put saw teeth on the front of the tank?" and then watched another man's name get welded onto history instead of his own. Two forgotten men stacked on top of each other, in a story that already has trouble remembering one. Now the numbers, because they close the argument the human stories opened. The United States produces roughly 49,000 Sherman tanks across the war. Germany manages perhaps 6,000 Panthers. That's not a marginal edge. It's a different universe of industrial capacity, and it means every Panther lost is nearly irreplaceable, while every Sherman lost is one of a river that keeps flowing. At Arracourt specifically, the ratio holds just as lopsided in miniature. Roughly 200 German armored vehicles destroyed or disabled against a fraction of that on the American side, over 11 days of continuous fighting. Logistics numbers tell the same story from a different angle. American ordnance and supply units keep fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing to the front at a rate German logistics, strangled by fuel shortages and Allied air interdiction, simply cannot match by late 1944. Here's the counterintuitive data point. Individually, tank for tank, American armor genuinely was inferior for most of the war, right through Arracourt itself. That fact is real and it isn't spin, but a system doesn't fight tank for tank. It fights everything at once: radios, recovery crews, artillery nets, air liaisons, and the sergeants trusted to act without waiting for permission. Translate the numbers into human terms and it comes down to this: American crews could afford to lose the individual duel and still win the battle, because the battle was never really about one tank against another. It was about which side could bring more of its whole system to bear in the same 60 seconds. So go back to that morning in Aachen, to Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole bleeding out on a stretcher, missing a leg to a single well-aimed Panther round. The question this video opened with was simple. If that's what a Panther can do to the best tanker in the U.S. Army, how do American tanks end up winning this war? The answer, the non-obvious one, is that they don't win it as individual tanks at all. They win it as a network. Radios talking to artillery, artillery talking to sergeants, sergeants trusted to make the call, mechanics dragging broken tanks back to life within a day, and truck drivers keeping all of it fed. German officers in post-war interviews and memoirs would return again and again to the same admission. It wasn't the Sherman's gun or armor that beat them. It was an enemy that could coordinate faster than they could react, and that kept fighting effectively even after individual crews and tanks were lost. A resilience their own increasingly threadbare system couldn't match by late 1944. And the paradox of the individual versus the system gets its final answer here too. Cullen's welding torch mattered. Poole's gunnery mattered. Clark's decision to trust his sergeants at Arracourt mattered. None of them alone wins the war. But strip any one of them out and the machine runs slower, bleeds more, and maybe doesn't hold that Lorraine fog long enough for the P-47s to arrive. The system needed heroes. It just didn't need any single one of them to be irreplaceable, which is a harder, sadder, more honest kind of tribute than the movies usually give. How close did the other outcome come? Closer than most people assume. Take away the fog burning off in time for the Thunderbolts to reach Arracourt. Take away Bradley's willingness to greenlight a sergeant's welding project on July 14th instead of dismissing it as a distraction. Take away the decision, made years before the war even started, to wire a radio into every single tank instead of rationing them to commanders. Any one of those breaks the other way, and this is a very different documentary. There's a principle sitting underneath all of this that has nothing to do with tanks. A team that trusts the people closest to the problem, keeps them talking to each other in real time, and can absorb the loss of its best individual pieces without collapsing, beats a team of brilliant individuals who have to wait for permission to act. That's true in a Lorraine fog in 1944. It's just as true in a hospital, a company, a cockpit, a classroom. Think about Cullen's welding torch, Clark's trust in his sergeants at Arracourt, and Poole's stretcher ride out of Aachen. 3 moments, 3 costs. One lesson learned the most expensive way a lesson can be learned, paid for in legs, in tanks that burned in seconds, in 29-year-old salesmen who came home changed and mostly unthanked. The system doesn't need the best equipment. It needs everyone in it to matter, and everyone in it to be replaceable. And somehow, impossibly, both of those have to be true at the same time.